There is a flower that does not know it is being used as a filter. It turns toward the sun the same way it always has, the same way its ancestors did for 500,000 years on the open plains of a continent it did not originate from. It builds its seed in spirals of 34 and 55, a pattern older than agriculture itself. And in 1994, on a poisoned pond 80 kilometers from a city that no longer exists, this flower was placed on a raft and asked to do something no flower had ever been formally asked to do before. Pull the poison out of the water. It complied, not because it understood the stakes. Because it had always been built this way, long before there was a stake to understand. What follows is the record of a disaster, a flower, and a kind of help that arrives without permission and without conditions. This is ancient food files. We exist to recover what disasters bury and history forgets to repeat. If you have not yet subscribed, consider doing so now, not for growth, but because what we preserve here does not remain in the public record by accident. What follows is an archive entry that begins not in ancient soil, but in contaminated water, 4 kilometers from a reactor that failed. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. On the 26th of April, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine suffered a catastrophic failure during a safety test. The explosion released radionuclides into the surrounding land, air, and water at a scale the modern world had not previously measured. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 settled into the soil and seeped into nearby ponds and waterways, including cooling reservoirs adjacent to the plant itself. These were not abstract contaminants. Cesium-137 mimics potassium, an element every living cell requires for basic function. Strontium-90 mimics calcium, the mineral that builds bone and structure. Radioactive isotopes, disguised as nutrients, were entering the same biological pathways that sustain ordinary life, and through those pathways, the food chain. The land itself had no mechanism for refusing this. Soil does not discriminate between calcium and its radioactive imposter. Water does not filter what dissolves into it. The exclusion zone, stretching outward from the ruined reactor, became a 30-kilometer radius where the ordinary processes of nature continued exactly as before, except now those processes were distributing poison instead of nutrients. 8 years after the disaster, in 1994, a multinational research effort led by the biotechnology company Phytotech, in coordination with Ukrainian scientists, introduced Helianthus annuus, the common sunflower, onto floating rafts positioned directly on a contaminated pond near the plant. The choice of platform mattered. Soil-based remediation faced a problem that water did not. Contaminants bound tightly to soil particles are difficult for any root system to access. Water offered no such resistance. Radionuclides dissolved in the pond were freely available, suspended, waiting. The sunflowers were lowered onto the surface in foam rafts, their root systems extending downward into the contaminated water like a net cast for something invisible. Within 10 days, researchers recorded that approximately 95% of the radionuclides present in the water column had been drawn out and concentrated within the plant tissue. The roots functioned as a biological filter, accumulating cesium and strontium at concentrations measured in the thousands of times higher than the surrounding water. This was not metaphorical cleansing. It was rhizofiltration, a precise mechanical process occurring at the molecular level, inside a plant that had no awareness it was performing remediation at all. The mechanism explains the speed. Because cesium resembles potassium and strontium resembles calcium, the sunflower's root cells did not need to evolve any new capability to absorb them. They simply mistook the poison for nourishment, drew it inward through transport channels built millennia earlier for entirely different purposes, and stored it in stem and leaf tissue the way the plant would ordinarily store any other mineral. The contamination did not require a new biological invention. It required only an old one, applied to a problem nature had never previously faced. The success in water was not matched by equal success in soil. Researchers and reporting from the period are explicit on this point. Sunflowers performed effectively in aqueous environments, but considerably less effectively when the contamination was bound within soil particles rather than suspended in water. According to figures attributed to Phytotech at the time, phytoremediation using sunflowers reduced cleanup costs in the water-based applications by approximately 10% compared to conventional chemical treatment methods. The flower had proven, in a controlled and measurable way, that it could do something genuinely useful. It had not proven that it could do everything. A second limitation followed close behind the first. The sunflowers, having concentrated the radioactive isotopes within their own tissue, became radioactive waste themselves. The contamination had not been destroyed. It had been relocated, compacted, made smaller and more manageable, but still present, still requiring disposal as hazardous material. The flower had not solved the disaster. It had translated it into a form that human systems could finally handle. The success was real enough to be repeated. In 2011, following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan, researchers organized a similar campaign, planting sunflower fields in regions affected by the meltdown, modeling the effort directly on the Chernobyl precedent from 17 years earlier. The results, by most subsequent accounts, were more modest than the original pond experiment. Soil conditions in Fukushima differed, and what had worked decisively in still water did not transfer as cleanly to contaminated agricultural land. The flower had limits. It had never claimed otherwise. It had simply done, under controlled conditions, exactly what its biology had always permitted it to do. What makes this story unsettling is not the flower's success. It is the quiet implication underneath it, that the tools required to face a catastrophe of this scale had existed, fully formed, for 500,000 years before the catastrophe occurred. The sunflower did not adapt to nuclear contamination. It had been hyper-accumulating heavy metals long before uranium was split for the first time. Evolved for a world of ordinary soil toxins, copper, cadmium, nickel, lead. The Chernobyl pond did not require a new organism. It required someone to notice that an old one already qualified. This is the pattern that recurs, again and again, in the relationship between modern crisis and ancient biology. The solution is rarely new. It is rediscovered, applied, and then, once the immediate emergency passes, quietly set aside, filed under disaster response rather than permanent practice, until the next failure makes it relevant again. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl remains, by most measures, uninhabitable for ordinary human settlement for generations to come. But the sunflower's demonstrated capacity has not gone unexamined. Bibliometric reviews of phytoremediation research show a steadily growing body of published work in the years since, extending into soil contamination cases far beyond the original nuclear context, industrial sites, mining runoff, regions with no nuclear history at all but the same underlying problem of heavy metal accumulation in water and ground. The flower did not change. The questions being asked of it did. The sunflower asks nothing in return for what it filters. It does not require funding, infrastructure, or permission to begin growing toward whatever light remains available, even in soil that has been poisoned, even floating on water that no longer supports anything else. It has done this, in one form or another, since long before the concept of a nuclear reactor existed, since long before there was an industrial system capable of producing the kind of contamination it would eventually be asked to address. What was learned at Chernobyl was not new knowledge. It was old biology, observed under new and urgent circumstances. The plant had always been capable of this. No one had simply needed it to be, until the spring of 1986 made the need impossible to ignore. The soil remembers what was poured into it. The flower, it turns out, remembers how to take some of that back. If this record matters to you, subscribe. Every entry preserved here is one that would otherwise pass without a witness.